experienced. So instead of saying it over and over again and make myself blue in the face, I thought we could do a lecture and say it all at one time. This bouncing ball thing is crucial because the bouncing ball shows how you can get weight and life into characters. I mean, the director will ask you, it's great animation, just give it more weight and life, and what the hell does that mean? And you go back to your desk and you want to shoot yourself. But really, it's a formula that is quite an easy trick, and once you've learned it, you can apply it to a million things. I actually got this from Frank Thomas, so it's certified for real, good seal of housekeeping approval on it. What we have here is a million dogs walking, and I like to work with live action because it's the basis of what we try to do, and what we try to do, of course, is caricature life. And what we'll do is start with a bouncing ball, and I'll take you through all its possibilities, and then we'll come back to this and I'll show you how it applies to this live action. So let's get into it. If I can just stop it, that would be good. I'm having my first technical breakdown. I can't stop the animation. Come on. How embarrassing. Okay, sorry about this, guys. Got to reboot. I've done this bouncing ball, and this may not look like much, but it's a textbook perfect bouncing ball, and I would like to go through it in great detail to show you why it works and how you can screw it up if you don't follow the rules. The basics of it are spacing and squash and stretch, but how much squash and stretch and how much spacing is dependent on personality and character. So first off, let's go after just weight, which is really spacing. And what I've got here is kind of a simple guide to show you what it is I'm doing. The big thing that so many animators seem to miss is that the gap between the top of the ball and where it contacts the ground has to be massive. And where you get into trouble is when this gap is too small. Really, you can't make that gap too big. The bigger the gap, the lighter the object. The smaller the gap, the heavier the object. But at the end of the day, it still has to be considerable. And so I find myself constantly having to adjust animators' drawings by taking the squash and dropping it, pulling it further down, just to get more accent on the weight. What's also crucial is the fact that it has to be 2 frames at the bottom, not more, not less. And I'll show you why that. I'll show you later how that doesn't work either if you have more or less. But the point is, the spacing has to favor the bottom for 1 frame, and then you have a big gap again, and then up it goes into its climb to the top. And what's also very crucial is that when an object is changing direction like this, it's very, very important that a silhouette not overlap in the 2 drawings that are closest to the top extreme. And that's better explained if you put the thing on 2s. Let me show you. Here's the same animation on 2s. And what I can show you 2 problems with this thing. One is that it shows you that what I've done is I've made sure that the spacing on the way up is less than the spacing on the way down. If I had the spacing identical on the way up and down, the thing would strobe. You'd get 4 frames, or you get 2 frames, and then it would go up and then come back and hold for another 2 frames there. And so the visual effect would be that it's more or less sticking a little lower, and then you just get this little jerk at the top. So that's very important. And where that's applicable is on things like fingers being pointed, or jaws dropping, or eyebrows snapping, where you try to use the same concept of bouncing ball applied to bits and pieces of the body. Again, I'll show you more about that, but just bear in mind that, hey, you got to make sure that the silhouettes don't overlap. The other thing this shows is that this is on 2s, and it still works. There's still a sense of weight here, but what you start to get is strobing. And where you can solve the problem, it'd probably be a mistake to put the whole thing on 1s, because then the thing would probably be mushy. So your best bet is to go and put the lower area here on 1s, and let this area up in here be on 2s. And usually the mixture of 1s and 2s gives a certain life and texture to the animation. So remember that when you see something strobe, just don't arbitrarily put the whole thing on 1s, because then the whole thing looks like it's underwater. Actually, the general rule of thumb is if you have to put something on 1s, be exceedingly careful about your spacing, and try to remember the bouncing ball exercise, and bank your spacing on 1s very carefully so it still is adhering to this theory that when the thing goes out and comes back, you make sure you have a big gap between your extremes where you want the weight. But the strobing also brings out another point, and that's the idea that if you put something in line, all our drawings start in line. And here's a good example which shows that the line is not strobing as much as the solid thing. If you see the solids tend to strobe more. The line is less contrasty, and therefore visually you don't get the strobe effect as badly. So it's a good bet that if the thing is slightly strobing in pencil test form, it'll definitely strobe in color. So just bear that in mind. This proves it, I think. Guys, can you see it? Can you see the thing is strobing more on the right? Anyways, let's move on. The spacing is so important that I can tell you that you can even take the squash right out of it, and it still has weight. It's very important to remember that squash is for life, and for giving it life, and spacing is for weight. And so, although this doesn't have life, it looks like a dead ball bearing, it definitely has weight. And so it's crucial, absolutely crucial, that the spacing be accurate. Let's go into it further. This has no in-betweens, and it's just the extremes. It's just up and down. Now, the effect here is very, very inorganic. It's extremely mechanical or man-made. And it's so easy to make animation look mechanical or stiff or non-organic. And the trick is, again, spacing and squash and stretch. And it's also very important that the timing favor, like you get, this benefits from the fact that there's a little bit more time at the top. If I were to, say, give this bottom frame equal timing, now I can make it even more equal than that. There, see, it's equal timing. And that's definitely machine-like. And so it was a lot better before when it was a little bit more time on the top. So it's important to work for contrast in timing. If you have equal timing, like this is, you get very, very machine-like animation. And you've got to apply that to character animation, where if you get even timing, it looks unnatural or man-made or boring, in fact, inorganic. So contrast in timing is very important. If you make the spacing even, you get the same problem. See, that's even spacing. And again, it has no weight, and even with the squash and stretch, it has no life. It looks very, very machine-like. And again, you need to look for that all-important gap at the bottom and the contrast and the timing at the top. A big mistake a lot of people make, or a myth or a thing they fall into, mistake they fall into, is they think, well, okay, if it's heavy, that means it must have more squash at the bottom. So add more time to the squash at the bottom. And that really doesn't do it. What you produce is quite a different effect. This has 2 extra frames at the bottom, two extra frames of squash at the bottom. And the effect is not more weight. What you get here is a sense of, it's like a little frog or something that's leaping, and although that is good, you break the rule knowing why you're breaking the rule. I'll show you, I'll go even further, and I'll add 6 frames to the bottom. And there, that's with 6 frames of squash. Now you can see that this doesn't look any heavier. It has a different sensation. It's more like a little frog or something. And I got a good story for that, and that's that on Black Cauldron, we were developing characters, and Handel Batoy was developing Gurgi, who was this little hairy, if you don't know, his little hairy creature that leaped about the forest. And he did this animation that looked a lot like this, where he added 6 frames at the bottom, and everybody thought, God, that's funny, that's great, that's you're a genius, it has so much life. And it was perfect. It was absolutely perfect for Gurgi. And then later on in a scene that I worked with him on, he did a scene where Gurgi bit an apple and then threw the apple away, and the apple bounced across the forest floor. And it bounced exactly on this same pattern. It had the 6-frame squash at the bottom. And I realized that Handel only knew how to do the bouncing ball this way. And he didn't really know the rules of the bouncing ball and just applied his timing to everything. And by sheer coincidence, it was good that he did it to Gurgi. It was perfect for Gurgi, but not so for the apple. And the director came to me and said, "This looks weird. The apple looks strange. Can you fix it?" And I knew how to fix it. The answer is to take 4 frames out of the squash and return it to the rule. So it's important to know the rule so that you can effectively know how to break it. And you break it for personality, or caricature, or comedy, or surprise, or whatever. But know the rules so that you can effectively break it. Let's see. The other way you can screw this up is to take to reduce the squash to only 1 frame at the bottom. And so what I have here is just 1 frame of squash. And let's just go through that and make sure here. Comes down. Yeah, there's only 1 frame. There's a big gap, 1 frame of squash, and up it goes. It looks weightless. It looks the illusion of life or weight is gone. And I've learned this the hard way too. I did a whole walk with Taran once. And it was a huge scene. It was like a 67-foot scene in Black Cauldron, and I had 1 squash drawing for 1 frame, and then I did the big gap, and I had all the timing at the top. And it looked like Taran was jerking around like this, and it was completely wrong. And so I had to go back and have my assistant in between all the squashes. In other words, go in here. Let me get the size right here. Go in here and add the 1 frame here. And that 1 frame makes all the difference. It brings it back to life and gives it a sense of weight. And so you have to do that with your animation. I can't tell you how many times I take guys' artwork upstairs in the QAR and physically take the squash drawing and physically rip it down on the pegs, pull it down a good solid 1/4 of an inch, and then tell them, hey, you got to put it in between that favors this one. or if it's on twos, you just take that one drawing and rip it down and expose it for 2 frames. I do that. God, I mean, I think a week doesn't go by that I don't do that trick with some guy's work. So just remember that's a real good way of giving weight back to your work. The question of how do you give more weight or less weight to something is a function of not then how many frames or how big of a squash. It's a function of height, how much gap. You see, these balls are all the same size, but clearly the guy on the left is much lighter, is a ping pong ball, and the guy in the middle might be a rubber ball, and the thing on the right might be a metal ball if it wasn't squashing so much. And it is in fact the gap that creates the illusion of weight, and then of course added with character design or scale in this case. Given scale and what would be ultimately character design, you definitely, the illusion is complete. And so I mean, this might be on the left, it might be a Brer Rabbit, or in the middle Brer Fox, and on the right Brer Bear, for example. And yet it's by the formula, by the book, they're all identical, and the only thing that's changed is the gap. Another illusion that people have is that, gee, if you add more squash to something, let's see here, too much squash. If you add more squash to it, it'll be heavier. And as you can see, it really doesn't make it heavier, it just makes it sillier. And that's okay if you have a silly character. The amount of squash and stretch is a dangerous thing, actually, and it's real easy for animators to go astray. Sometimes, well, let me show you the next example. Excuse me, I didn't call up the right one. Yeah, this is way over the top. You see the squash is just right down there. And for something like that, that's perfectly acceptable for something like Roger Rabbit or Tex Avery, or any character that calls for this amount of silliness. Squash and stretch is very, very, very character dependent. And the two mistakes that I see guys go, it's such a delicate balance of caricature where you can go too far or not far enough, and guys will either go too far, like if you take Cecilia and squashed her this far, it would make her look stupid. The other danger is that you don't squash her enough, and so she starts to look stiff. And that's a fine balance that is very hard to hit, and it just takes time and taste, I suppose, and experience. But what you really can do to give something like Cecilia life is a thing you can squash and stretch is the drag and follow through, and by that I mean drapery, hair, anything like tails or even body parts like hands and stuff. You can squash and stretch or overlap those, which give the illusion of squash and stretch without actually deforming the character to the point of ridiculousness. So let's get into drag and follow through and examine that as how it relates to squash and stretch. See, without adding any more squash and stretch, I'm getting quite a bit more for my money with the tail. And here's the animator's great trick, really, on when utilizing straighter characters. I think your heroes, whether it's Balto or Cecilia or Louis, you can only squash and stretch them up to a point. But what you can do is you can squash and stretch your material or your hair wildly. You can't go too far with that kind of with drag and follow through. So you're getting a lot more for your money. And actually, that's a trick that the the WED engineers, when they were designing Disneyland, found with the audio animatronic characters is that because of the nature of the machinery and the robots, they couldn't move them very much for very long without them basically breaking themselves. For a one-off demonstration, they can make those things move very quickly and beautifully. But since they sit there year in, year out, they literally beat themselves to death. And so they've had to turn down the motion of these things. And so what they've done is they've made sure that all the characters, like in Pirates of the Caribbean or something, wear very, very silky, baggy clothing so that everything follows through. And they put fans on them so that it wiggles. And they put hats with long plumes just so you get extra motion and squash and stretch and therefore life out of what is basically fairly lifeless objects. So my suggestion is, please go crazy with squash and stretch. Go crazy with the follow-through. Another great example in the animation world is Eric Larson did that great dance sequence with in Lady and the Tramp with Peggy Lee. What was the character's name? Peg? Yeah, Peg. She does that He's a Tramp song. And her movements are very subtle and slinky, but they went crazy on the hair. You should just take a look at that. The hair goes totally up, totally down, totally up, totally down. And it's just completely floppy. And yet her actions are very, very subtle. But the hair is going crazy. And you get so much more animation for your money. And it just looks great. And yet the primary action is very, very subtle. So please. Milt was an absolute ripoff of this thing. If you look at all his scenes, this stuff is just floppy as hell. And I would always say that to myself when I was animating. I would think floppy, what can I flop? Floppy, floppy, floppy. Because, the animation can be very, very subtle, and yet, you get a lot for your money out of the follow-through. And really, there's no end to it. Here, I did a little animation. Same bouncing ball, and yet I've got all sorts of follow-through on the hair, the tail, the hands, and even the eyes and the blink are adding to the weight and the overlap. Now, you're laughing, aren't you? You're giggling. It's funny, right? I've gone from a boring bouncing ball to comedy, and I've just done it with follow-through, see? So I'm getting entertainment just from follow-through. It's a very powerful thing, and don't you forget it. But the question is, how do you apply this to the real world? Again, I'll work with live action because live action is what we were caricaturing. This is a Muybridge walk, and it's good to use a Muybridge walk because basically it shows when you trace off live action how incredibly stiff and lifeless it can be. And what it's missing, of course, is squash and stretch and spacing, up and down bouncing ball spacing. So let's get into it and see how we can make this thing better. I've done a walk here that has no squash and stretch on it, and no bounce, and it's about as dead and as lifeless as you can get. But it brings out an important point that you can actually do animation. I've actually seen animation done with this stiff style, and it can be hilarious. So if you know what the rules are, you can break it for comedy. A good example is Caricature, and we had a guy, I don't know how many of you guys know, a guy called Don Hahn, who used to walk just like this. His head never moved. There was no bounce to it, and he would just cruise along. And if ever he would walk behind partitions, right, and it would look like he was on a skateboard sliding behind the thing. And if I was going to do an animation of Don Hahn, I would definitely take out all squashings, out all the bounce, and I would do so knowing what I'm doing because I would be trying to caricature Don Hahn. And in taking out something that we expect, it becomes surprising and therefore funny. And surprise and caricature is the best kind of humor. So I'm going to try to make this work from a textbook point of view, but I'm saying you can do this if you know what you're doing, if you want to do it and make it funny. But what I'm going to do is what I typically do is if I look on the QAR, I'll go through and I'll say, well, there's the squash drawing. And what I'll do is I'll pull this guy down as far as I can, really. And just that starts to bring more life into it. And then, of course, what you need on top of that is follow-through. And here's where we get into the bouncing ball applied to follow-through. As you can see, what we have here is the pelvis is a bouncing ball, and so is the head. And the head is following the same, formula as the pelvis. It's just offset by 4 frames, or 1 frame. In this case, 1 extreme. And you've got to remember that to give everything weight, it all still has to follow the bouncing ball formula, or else your follow-through starts to look mechanical, man-made, stiff, and lifeless. And there's really no end to what you can do here. You can make the jaw. Notice that the jaw is the same formula. It's still a bouncing ball, and its follow-through to the head. And Milt was famous for, he actually picked it up from Freddie Moore, would design it so that he would look through the dialogue and find all the accents wherever the mouth was open the most, and then work backwards and place all his footsteps in anticipation to the mouth being open the most, so that he would time it just right so that the foot would come down, then the head, then the jaw on the accent. So he would talk like this, and it's a formula that he did his entire career, and so did Freddie Moore. And if you look at the old Mickeys, they would, all this stuff is in The Illusion of Life, but the placement of walking during dialogue can be done this way and work every single time. And in fact, if you don't do this, what you find yourself doing is having mouths opening as the head is coming down, and you go through awkward drawings. It starts to not look right. It starts to fight the animation. So rather than fight with it, you work with it, and you find your placement and make sure that the character steps, pelvis down, head down, and the mouth snaps, then the jaw snaps open on the accents that you want to hit in the dialogue. And it works every time. So let's go to the next finger follow-through. This maybe isn't the best example of that, but you don't always have to think in terms of the bouncing ball as being up and down. It can be laterally or up and down this way. Here's a case where the character is shaking his hand, and again, if you look at Milt's work, he's constantly having characters point. And whenever you look at that point, again, it's one of these things where if it's on a step, it's the pelvis first, then the chest, then the head, then the fist. Well, then elbow, then fist, if you want to get totally technical, and then of course the finger is the last thing after that. But in doing so, you create a real sense of weight and follow-through that runs through the entire body. And although it takes a lot of analysis, the end effect is a tremendous sense of life and fluidity. What's important in all this, and I was always accused of putting too many charts on my scenes, but if you can be analytical without losing the sense of life, spontaneity, what's important is that you chart everything so that it's so that everything is bouncing and has that gap, that it's 2 frames at the end. So in the case of the point, it would be literally starting slowly, taking off quickly, big gap, 2 frames out, big gap coming back, and recoiling into its original position. And that takes some very careful charting that is going to probably be quite a bit different than the charting on the pelvis or the head or the dialogue or whatever. And so my animation typically had, oh God, easily 4 or 5 charts to try to get all these bouncing balls working in concert. And the end effect is very, very smooth. It doesn't look mechanical. In fact, it will look mechanical if you don't do it. And although this sounds complex, if you can just fight your way through a couple of cycles, or a couple of test animations, just to force yourself to learn how to do this kind of thing, it becomes second nature after a while. And it also helped me to put a lot of extremes in. I usually animated straight ahead on 2s every second frame, and that way I'm basically controlling the thing down to down to the nth degree. I think if you pose stuff, with lots of missing in-betweens, it starts to become very difficult to get all that to work in charts, and also becomes difficult to explain all that to your assistant. Probably the best way to do it is, if you want to do it with posing, is to have your assistant rough it in, and then go back in and change the bits and pieces you need to in order to get the primary and secondary action to be bouncing with the right amount of gap. But there's no end to this. You can also do it with eyes. This, again, is perhaps not the greatest example, but the blink is got weight too. It's following the bouncing ball thing too. You'd be surprised with a blink. You can make that follow the same bouncing ball, and you can get a blink to have weight. Now, although that's not really important in long shots or something, in close-ups, it really does make a difference. If you want to have that, eyelids have weight, and if you want to give it weight, what you do is you do the bouncing ball. It takes off slowly, big gap, hits its squash, one small in-between favoring the bottom like crazy, big gap, and up you go again. And you'll get a very, very powerful blink by doing that technique. You can also do the same thing with eyebrows. Again, this is not the greatest example. I'm getting follow-through on the eyebrows, but I'm also getting my bouncing ball effect. Where that's pretty successful is in reverse, when you do a take, for example, and you want those eyebrows to have weight going this way now. What you do is you start with your anticipation, the eyebrows fly open, and big gap, bounce across the top, small favor, big gap, and then settle. Bang, like that. So there's you're giving eyebrows weight. You can get quite subtle with this concept. Let me move into the four-legged world. It gets even more sophisticated. Yeah, this is again just a silhouette of live action, and probably if I was directing this, I would probably say, well, we need to go in and find our squash. The trot's probably the easiest thing to start animating because, of course, the pelvis and the chest are going up and down at the same time. When you get into the walk and the run, as you'll see, it becomes quite a different matter because it's all out of sync. But the trot's a piece of cake because it's all going up and down at the same time. So what I would do is find my squash, which is sort of in here, and I'll just do a hack job here of lowering Lassie. You can just bang him down lower, and okay, so that's one side. But you can see just that one side starts to have more punch to it. And then I would probably use this one as our squash. And lower it a bit more. And admittedly, what you'd have to do is go back in and draw the legs and draw, the internal bones squashing to make that work, to make it look like a good drawing. But you see, with hardly any effort, I've given the thing a lot more bounce. And it starts to caricature the thing. It starts to take it away from live action, the curse of live action. You've heard about the curse. Well, that's the curse of live action. This is how you fix it, is you go after the squash and stretch. And then of course, the other thing you go after is the follow-through. You'd go nuts with the tail and the hair and the ears, and perhaps even the nose. You'd start to follow through the nose. Let's take a look at the squash and stretch on this thing. Yeah, gives you an idea of the pelvis and the chest are more or less going up and down at the same time. Not quite. What is this? 26. Yeah. What's crucial here is to show that when you go to the squash and stretch, what you're doing, of course, is if you pull it down, you have to bend this. And I'm sure maybe Christoph and Jeff have already explained that to you. But a thing that always breaks my heart about animators is they don't seem to understand that the scapula is not pinned to the chest. It's actually attached here. And people seem to always plug the arms and the legs onto the side of the chest, and it's really sad because good acting is very much using the shoulders, and the shoulder is not attached to the chest at all. It's attached to the pit of the neck, and you can move the shoulder in tremendous arcs, and gives you all sorts of acting possibilities, and in this case squash and stretch. So when a dog's chest goes down, the scapula is rising very much above the chest, as much as 3 inches. Next time you get your hands on a dog, physically take his leg and see how far you can push the scapula around. It won't hurt him. But, and that's the point. It won't hurt him because it's totally flexible. And it'll go way up above the spine and way down below. You can, it slides. And it's all attached by the collarbone to the pit of the neck. And the other problem that I see a lot is, let me just get into this thing here. Yeah. The other problem that occurs a lot is that people don't seem to understand that this bone and that bone are always parallel, always. And they are made parallel by the Achilles tendon here, which acts like a mechanism that will always keep that leg parallel. And it's like a machine. And next time you get your hands on a dog, try that. Try bending his leg in relationship. Now, it doesn't hurt. I mean, these dogs, they love it. They think they're being scratched. You take his leg and you try and bend it away from his femur. And you can't do it. It won't go. The tolerance, the range is half an inch, tops. It's definitely a mechanism that keeps it parallel at all times. And where that becomes deceiving is the fact that you don't really see this bone. What you see is this line here. You see this line here and that line there, which that's coming off of the kneecap and attaching to the pelvis. So you have a muscle that's coming from the end of the pelvis here and attaching to the back end of the pelvis there. And so you see these two lines, and these two lines are never parallel to that. And so I guess you get lost in a drawing and don't realize that these lines are always parallel. So it's important to know that this is the pelvis, and at the center of the pelvis is this line, is the femur coming off of it, and it is always parallel to the, what are those, metatarsals? Anybody? Is that what it is? I think these femur and metatarsal. And they're always parallel. And again, that's really important because I see all the time, let me just look at this one before we read it. What I see all the time is bad drawings. And I got some bad drawings here that I've drawn. This is impossible, what he's doing here. And the reason it's impossible, if you draw through it, is that there's his femur, and there's the metatarsal, and so you get into a very, very awkward drawing. And I see it on a daily basis. I saw it with the dinosaurs, and I saw it with the and it's such a simple thing. You just have to simply remember that there's a line here. It goes like that. Now, if you want that foot up there for whatever reason, let's say he's peeing on a fire hydrant or something, then the whole mechanism has to bend to incorporate it. In other words, the foot can go up, that's fine, but then you have to remember that femur is like that and it's parallel to that, right? Kneecap. Muscle that kind of is squashing around the thing. Yeah? And I got one more drawing here. The other way you can do it is you bend it backwards the other way. See, there's the femur there, and then the metatarsal is going backwards like that, and that always produces it looks horrible. It looks like, he was hurt in a terrible accident. And so what you need to do, of course, is straighten the poor dog out. Like that, and again, getting his femur and metatarsal more or less parallel. Again, if you have to have the foot back there like that, then the whole mechanism has to come with it. So you get a basically a stretch is what you get. But that's something that you guys got to remember, because I see it so often. Let's try a run. That's a bit more complicated. Again, if this was a piece of animation, there's so much lost power in just the follow-through of things like the tail, and you could exaggerate the squash and stretch. Just you've got this magnificent stretch here, and there's nothing stopping you from taking a little liberty with that, stretching a little bit more, or a squash here. This is your squash. There's nothing stopping you from, squashing that even more. Just to give it more life, basically. If you look at the guts of the run, what it still is two bouncing balls, but in this case it's circular. But that doesn't change the fact that what you have is most of your drawings. If you look at the pelvis, for example, most of the drawings are packed at the top, and there's a big gap. See, big gap down there, a couple drawings, and then it's circling back up again, or the same thing's happening on the chest, where you've got a couple drawings at the bottom. And most of your drawings are at the top. Since this is live action, I was following it around, the spacing's a little even and slightly mushy, and I would want to go back in there and clarify the spacing on the chest and the pelvis to really give it the snap and the life and the weight that it would need to take, again, the curse off the live action. But you can see, again, the analysis where you have two different bouncing balls, and of course then the head is a third. The one thing that you can really do with a dog in a run is to give it the to analyze what you can squash and what you can't. And what you can't is almost just as important as what you can. Things that do squash and stretch, obviously, are the tail, fur, ears, big floppy feet, nose. Spine, fat, all that can be changed. What you can't do is things that are solid bone. The pelvis, for example, is a non-squashable thing and will always stay a box where you can't change that. And the chest is another thing, and that's locked. And so is the brain case. But that's okay, because what that gives you is a sense of contrast, basically, in your drawing, because you have a very, very stiff thing, and then you have a very, very flexible spine, and then you have a very, very stiff chest, and then another flexible neck, and then another very stiff brain case. And so if you can utilize those elements, use the stiff part like a bouncing ball, with the spacing, and make sure your spacing is excellent, and then get everything you can out of the spine, you'll get a very, very powerful scene. And it's important that the spine is actually almost the second thing you want to work on, because it determines the force of the action. Because you want to make sure that that spine, is going from, in this case, straight, if you look at the animation, to, in this case, your squash. You want to make sure you're doing a definite change of shape from straight to curve, straight to curve, straight to curve. Again, if you don't sort those things out, your animation will have, again, the curse of live action on it, or be weak and middle of the road. Let's just go here to a walk. Now, by far, the walk is the most difficult thing, because it's slow, and you can all the technical inaccuracies show up, and also because it's got a very sophisticated bouncing ball. You see, the bouncing balls are firing off at different times, and it's crucial that you get that to work and get the offset quality to that, or else the whole walk starts to fall apart. I'm sure Christoph and Jeff have talked in greater detail. I won't go into the analysis of what foot hits when, but that's something you can actually just get out of a book. What you can't get out of a book is the ability to give it life and weight. But the one small thing before I end that I wanted to point out was that given a walk like this, it's more important, the more subtle the action, to give it more animation by giving it follow through. And the best thing you can do for a dog is to sorry, I'm just trying to find my way into this new file here. I'll go back to the live action here. The best thing you can do is a tail. And tails are important on dogs because it's real easy to make them look like cat tails if you bend them too far. You have to remember that most dog tails are fairly stiff things, and they tend to want to only curve up. They don't tend to curve in reverse. They don't hyperextend like a cat's does. And they certainly can't do an S-curve thing. I've noticed that foxtails can do that, but dogs tend to be stiff and upward swinging like that. And where that gives you problems is in perspective, because as a dog tail goes away from you, it tends to not look like a dog tail. It just tends to disappear into a stump, and you have to fight yourself to not draw a dog tail constantly looking like a dog tail, or else then it looks like it's wagging up at an angle. You know what I mean? You have to, as it goes away from you, it turns into basically a stump, and you can see that pretty clearly. Say up on the top left-hand corner, you can see this guy's waving his tail fairly aggressively, but you're going through some pretty ugly drawings there. You have to make a drawing that looks wrong, basically, to make it look right in motion. And it only really reveals itself as a full tail once during the cycle. If you look at some of these guys, most of them are not hyper-extending with even this Dalmatian down here in the corner, right there. His tail tends to go backwards on itself, but not too far. At the most, it just goes out to a straight line. There's a subtle bend there, but it's not wanting to. And that's so crucial, because if you go too far with it, it'll look like a cat. And I've drawn a lot of dogs that look like they had cattails, so I know it's easy to do. That's sort of all I know. That's the end of the lecture. Does anybody have any questions? No? No questions? How does the timing of the bouncing ball affect what? Well, it doesn't actually. That's a good point. It doesn't matter actually. You can have as many or as little frames on the top end as you want. Obviously, if you take out too few, you have to have the 2 frames at the bottom. And if you have 2 frames at the top, it starts to look like a sewing machine. It starts to look like a machine. And because there's no contrast in timing, I did a pig run, hen wen in Black Cauldron, and I was trying to find the very top end of how fast a pig could run. And the first thing I tried was a 4-frame cycle. And what that meant was 2 frames down and 2 frames up with a gap in the middle. And Ted Berman, who was the director, the first thing he said was, "It looks like a sewing machine." And so I didn't really want to slow it down. So what I did was I added 1 frame at the top. So you had 3 frames up, 2 frames down. And so it was a 5-frame cycle. And it took the curse off instantly. It instantly had life and looked like a real pig. And I brought Ted down again and I said, "You think it looks like a sewing machine?" He said, "No, it looks fine." You know, just one frame made a difference. So it's crucial. It's got to be 3 frames or more. And anything, how much more is totally dependent on what you're doing with your animation. Any other questions? No? I guess I'm supposed to look at the tape of some people's work. Tim, do you want to wire me up, or do I? How do I make a jump across? Is Tim there?
Bill, can you print those out?
Sure. I've got, this is from a software called Real Things, and it's an absolute library of live action cycles.
Because I think it'd be great to transcribe everything you said and put it in the book.
Yeah, the video will be available at the shop. Tell me, I guess I'm the guest critiquer here. Is that what I'm supposed to do? Who's animation? Let's embarrass somebody. Where am I supposed to start? Does anybody? Is this queued up, Tim?
Yeah, it just that's the last few tests that have been shot. Cause I think Christoph did them yesterday.
Do I go? Where do I start?
Play from there.
Right from there, from Rick. All right. Well, wait a minute. Before we get into Don, let's go talk about Rick. Is Rick in the room? Rick? Are you here, Rick? Speak up. I'm not going to wait. I don't want to trash you publicly. No, it's fine. The problem, of course, is like what we were talking about. It's got. This is not cooperating. The walk, although technically the trot, you got a walk first and then a trot. The very first thing I would say is that we've got to make sure that the pelvis and the chest are squashing more, and the head, although it's sort of following through, the nose is not, and so you get a very, very stiff sense of the head going up and down like this, and just the nose following through will bring the whole thing to life. So my criticism with both the walk and the trot would be more squash and stretch. You can especially see it on the trot, how stiff that head is. Yeah, it could do a good dose of follow through on the nose. So let's go through to Don's work. The tail, my God, it's the same thing. More squash and stretch on the chest and the pelvis. It's beautiful drawing. It's technically it's all there. I mean, you've got good drawing there, and it's got it's technically all the feet are happening at the right time and stuff. But there's a lifelessness to it, which would be so easily solved by bouncing the pelvis and the chest more. Following through on the nose more, making sure that the tail flopped. Look for flopping. That's the key to entertaining, lifeful animation. Look how stiff that tail is. The tail almost looks like a single trace back that's been shifted, you know, backward. Is Don here? Please, somebody? I can't see. All right. Yes, people make these tests and then disappear. But, hi. Well, that's funny because that's got more squash and stretch in the chest, all right, but it seems strange. It's funny. Why is that not working? Huh. I have a feeling that the problem here is not for lack of bounce in the chest, but it seems to me that it'd be more a function of the spacing, that it's even timing up and down, or too much time on the bottom. I think maybe that's it. It's equal. Yeah, that's it. I think it's equal timing on the top and bottom. It's the yeah, it's equal. The chest is both down is down as long as it is up, and that's giving it a strange quality to it. The tail's following through better. That's good. The nose seems to stick in space. It's following through. It's better, but you could bang that nose even further down as a piece of follow through. Also, there's a strangeness to the way the foot. Oh, I see. The anatomy and the drawing of the forefoot is very strange there. It's bent too high, and the paw seems too long, and so it's creating. Yeah, look at that. That's bent way too high. You would have to bend. This section here at the paw is way too long. I would cut that in half. Probably that would fix it. Go a long ways to making it look a lot more natural. And then what's it having? That's sort of a goose step quality to it. I think it has a goose step quality to it because, again, the front leg is too long. It's just physically going too long. It's to shorten that paw. That's better. That's actually pretty good. Who is this person? Andy? Is Andy in the room? Hi, Andy. It's pretty good. Is this supposed to be Jenna? There's well, the reason I ask about Jenna is because the feet are fairly high. In other words, the feet are picking up and setting down unusually high, which is a great way to say, you know, a lady. It's a kind of has a sort of a Jenna quality. I think you wouldn't want to do that with every dog. Each walk has to be designed for the personality. I would imagine something like BALTO or some of the male dogs. The bigger male dogs are going to be heavier, and they're going to be lazier and not want to pick their feet up so high off the ground. So what you've done there is great for Jenna. Jenna, because it's very prim and precise, and it's very precise and ladylike walk. But I wouldn't do that for any of the other dogs. Again, the break on the break here, this seems a bit long to me. I don't know. Maybe it's got a stylized drawing. It'd probably be better if there was a bit more meat here, but that seems long to me. So it gives sort of a weird feeling to it. Your trot's pretty good. Trot seems fairly solid. The tail is real stiff. Yeah, the tail is following through. It works, but it's very stiff. You could, again, you'd be surprised at how far you can push follow through, and still it doesn't disrupt the personality or the character. But what you do have that's good is the head seems to be following through at the right time, and the nose is following through too. This is a fairly stiff and proper dog. most dogs will be moving a bit more. So the overall feeling is sort of on show, stiff and regal. In a normal situation, they might be moving a bit more. It's a fine line. It's is Jason here?
Yeah.
Hi, Jason. That looks a bit small. From a drawing point of view, the head's too small. I would say that the it's not bad. The spacing on the bouncing ball thing is not well worked out, or you haven't gone in and tightly analyzed to make sure that we get the spacing on the bouncing ball. The chest is kind of going up and down at the right time, but it'll greatly improve the crispness of the animation if you make sure you get that gap in the bouncing ball effect. It's a little bit, it's a little bit mushy because of the spacing, the evenness of the spacing. So let's go on to the other thing here. Yeah, well, that's a classic example where there's almost zero up and down on the chest. See, if you look at the chest, it has almost nothing to it. It's probably even less than the live action I was showing you. So I would say, I would say that's probably the biggest thing that's missing. I mean, there's other things that I could comment on, but it's follow-through is a little bit funky on the nose. It could and should be more. Yeah, the nose is just kind of moving, and it really should be chest, head, nose, chest, head, nose, chest, head, nose, and you've got to make sure you get that. What you have there is no chest moving, no head moving. The nose is just kind of moving in randomly, so there's no control and analysis on that head. So you watch it; it's just kind of all over the place. All right, so Max, are you in the room? That's pretty good. You get away with murder when you get away from cycles. Cycles separate the men from the boys. When you get into acting scenes, where characters moving about in erratic sort of ways, who's to say how that dog's going to move? I mean, he's acting, so of course he would be moving differently. So it's great that you've done a little scene, but on the other hand, you haven't really taught yourself or proved to me that you can do a good walk. It looks good, but
I did it on the spot actually.
Did you? And then what? Spaced it out?
Yeah. Did it at the same time.
Yeah. Why is it coming up? Or did he shoot?
No. I mean, when I animated it, I was going back and doing.
Yeah. It's hard for me to, because a cycle repeats itself and you get to see the thing malfunction repeatedly. It's easier to analyze it and therefore learn and make sure that you know what the hell you're doing before you launch into an acting scene. That's not to put down what you've done. It looks good. The thing seems to, and again, it's hard for me to say, but it seems to not be bouncing. There's no bounce on the chest and pelvis in the first couple of steps, and then as he slows, there seems to be more of it, and it comes to life. By the third and fourth step, it seems to be coming more to life. And again, it's hard to see the very first few frames of a scene, so you could get away with it. In other words, I wouldn't, in production, ask you to fix that, but if there was animation before it, for example, where your eye had time to get to see the scene, and then you passed through those first two steps you can see now, it would look probably fairly weightless. And I would ask you to go in and find the squashes and pull them down 1/4 of an inch.
The difference, we were discovering the other day that the difference between doing a cycle on the spot animation and an animation across the screen in an acting scene is that you obviously, because it's on the spot, you can detect all the subtleties of movement. And sometimes they won't show up so clearly when it's moving across the screen. You find that in your own experience. You have to, when you're doing cycle, treat it differently. Because it's on the spot, things that are exaggerated in cross movement on the screen suddenly appear much more radical on the spot.
You're saying you see the problems more clearly when it's in a cycle.
Not that they're problems, it's just that in order to see ups and downs in movement across the screen, you need to enhance them more in a piece of animation going, with something moving across the screen as opposed to doing on the spot.
Yeah, I mean, it's fair to say, yes. I mean, when you have
That's what
when you have other movement competing visually for attention, you have to exaggerate the things you want to make sure you want read. And since we do want weight to read, you want these characters to look to look like it's a 70-pound dog. You do want to exaggerate. Your point is right. You do want to exaggerate the squash and stretch because other things are detracting from attention. And in a cycle, it's so clinical. You see the problems more clearly when it's in a cycle.
Not that they're problems, it's just that in order to see ups and downs in movement across the screen, you need to enhance them more in a piece of animation going, with something moving across the screen as opposed to doing on the spot.
Yeah, I mean, it's fair to say, yes. I mean, when you have
That's what
you have other movement competing visually for attention, you have to exaggerate the things you want to make sure you want read. And since we do want weight to read, you want these characters to look to look like it's a 70-pound dog. You do want to exaggerate. Your point is right. You do want to exaggerate the squash and stretch because other things are detracting from attention. And in a cycle, it's so clinical.
Does that mean you have to do separate animation then? Does that mean that what works as a cycle might
Not really, because if you can't see it when you flip it in your hand, it ain't there. The beauty of flipping it in your hand is the fact that it's such an intrinsically crude thing, and it's very hard to see a scene anyways when you flip something, that it has to be exaggerated in order to see it, and exaggeration is not a bad thing. So, yeah, if it's not on the page, it won't be on the stage. But the point of doing a cycle is important because at the end of the day, we're actors and we're performers. And what you need to do is get this stuff learned so deeply ingrained. Go through the hell of learning to do it academically and properly so that you can do it in your sleep. And then when it comes time to do a scene, you are not being hung up by what foot should contact when. That stuff is in you, and you don't have to think about it, and you can concentrate on the emotions that you're trying to portray. I mean, that's the point of doing a cycle, is you just want to master the technique so that you can concentrate on the performance. Let's go forward. But Max, it's good. Is this yours? Is that your work as well, Max? That's somebody else's. That's Kay's. Kay, are you in the room? Yeah. You've got a light blue line there.